quite sure why. I guess because I had to learn this information in kind of an academic sense rather than from studying ravens. And I think probably like you, I have almost, could be inherent, the case is made similar to this program, it's almost an inherent affection for ravens, that there may be some coevolution going on between humans and ravens over time. The case can be made for sure. Anyhow, I regularly talk to ravens. I don't know about you. Yeah, and they often respond. There's a funny story here at the end, how that happened for somebody. But it's just delightful to have them turn around and come back and look you over. And they're very cool birds. So there's probably more going on in their bird brains than I realized before I looked into this program and learning more about ravens. They're pretty bright birds. I guess we would say they're generalized with corvids. I mean, with the rest of the corvids, that the corvids are the smartest birds of the 9,500 birds that exist, except for the parrots, which are equally smart. So this is, I'm going to rate on here. This is a Tlingit art by a Tlingit artist that illustrates the story that it was pretty dark because there was no sun, and the raven went to where the sun was hiding and grabbed it and dragged it out to where it could light up the world. It's not known for sure whether that's a true story, but I think it's clearly true that ravens do light up our day. We can say that about them. So we're going to rave on about ravens. But before we go to ravens, I wanted to just mention the family, the Corvidae, because they're so impressive. I had no idea, to tell you the truth, that they could be so beautiful. So here's a couple. A blue magpie from Sri Lanka and an Indo-Chinese green magpie. So we have a green jay in the southern United States. Some of you are probably familiar with it. I have never seen it that I can remember. It goes, I'm sure, all the way through Central America. A green jay that is the equal of these two. So they get remarkably colorful, given that ours are either black or black and white. Well, the magpies and the crows and the jays, ravens at least. So the Corvidae. Corvidae is a family of birds in the order Passeriformis, perching birds. There are about 100 families in the passerines, the Passeriformis, about 100 families. There are about 200 families total. These numbers jump around. You can find a lot of different numbers online, and I think that taxonomists don't agree. There's about 200 families of birds, and 100 of them are in the Passeriformis, and that's one order. And there are 28 orders, so there must not be that many birds in the other 27 orders. It's clearly the biggest order of birds, Passeriformis, and it's this 3 toes forward, 1 toe back. The ability to perch in the way that they do is one of their distinguishing characteristics. They're often called songbirds. I think that's not particularly accurate. So here's our nice photo of a raven in flight. And one of the things that we'd like to work on tonight is how you tell a raven from a crow, because they're quite similar. And some of you, well, Melanie brought this up when I was here 2 weeks ago. I want to know how you tell. It is hard to tell them apart, certainly in flight or one without the other. So a couple of distinguishing characteristics in this particular picture that makes this a raven and not a crow is that gigantic bill, of course. Raven has a good size, a crow has a good sized bill, but this is really almost gargantuan. The way the primaries spread is almost exaggerated, and you won't tend to see that on a crow. And the tails are different, as you probably know, of crow and a raven, with the raven tail being either wedge-shaped when it's closed or looking very much like a fan when it's spread out, as it is in this picture, whereas in a crow it'll be closer to straight across and not be tapered around the arc. So that's one way to, so the wing, also the wing sound. See if we can get a wing sound here. Now this may deafen us. Let's see where this is. Let's see, it's this one. So the wing sound, ravens have a wing sound. I don't know if they always have it, but they frequently do, and I've certainly heard it, and crows do not. And here's what the wing sound sounds like. So it was described somewhere as the rustling of silk. I don't know if that sounds like the rustling of silk to you, but it's a noisy sound made by probably the surface area of their wings displacing so much air. And if you hear that sound, it's another indication that you've got a raven on your hands and not a crow. Ah yes, Corvus corax. So Corvus corax is the scientific name. Corvus means crow in Latin. And corax is supposedly onomatopoetic. I'm going to move this away from my mouth a little bit. Corax! Corax! They're saying corax. And supposedly, everything I know I read. Raven also. Raven! Raven! They say they're onomatopoetic, and that's where those names came from. Just in case you wondered. So ravens are reputed to be so intelligent. What are they intelligent about? I was mildly disappointed when I read the material, especially Heinrich is really, The Mind of the Raven is really an enjoyable book, I thought. And I'd read it before, and this time when I read it, I was taking notes, and that really helps. I mean, I may remember a few things, whereas I couldn't remember anything. Anyhow, he's spent years with ravens and is impressed with their intelligence, but mostly what they're intelligent about is surviving in the biological world. They're intelligent about eating, getting enough to eat, about not getting eaten, which is survival, and about reproducing. And so all these brilliant little behavioral ploys that they exhibit usually can be defined in one of these ways. The only other thing I can think of that they do on occasions is play. And arguments can be made that that's training for eating, not getting eaten, and surviving. But it's charming when you see an animal playing. Anyhow, this is, their great intelligence is often displayed when pursuing these aspects of biological reality. Here's a range map. They're extremely widespread. For one species, this is Corvus corax, it's all over the northern hemisphere, not very much, not at all in the southern hemisphere, which is actually curious, come to think of it. Well, they say the Corvidae evolved in the southern hemisphere, and they often will say, actually, in Australia, but ravens did not evolve in Australia. And so their range and habitat diversity is really remarkable, from sea level to, they've been seen at 20,600 feet on Mount Everest, and in the deserts of northern Africa, and in the at least dry rainforests of Central America. So just an extremely adaptable bird, which is a characteristic of this family. The fact that they do have flexibility of behavior, which can also be described as intelligence, allows them to adapt to many, many different kinds of habitats. Where'd my bird go? There it is. So, is this a raven or crow? It's a raven. And we can, if nothing else, the bill gives it away immediately. The bill just would not be so profoundly stout if it was a crow. Also, partly the thickness of the neck, the fact that it is a thick neck, but it's thick because it has these special display feathers, which we'll see spread out, that are different than anything that a crow has on the neck, and it thickens up the neck. So males are slightly larger than females. So is this a male or a female? Okay, you got that. I thought maybe you would try and answer that. Young or old. So they say with the young, I don't think I've ever actually noticed this, but young tend to have a little bit of brown coloration on their wings and on their tail. And young will have pink mouth lining, which we can't see in this image. But there's definitely no brown. It certainly looks like full grown. So I would say this is probably an adult raven. We can't tell if it's male or female. You can't tell males from females without seeing them side by side or without certain sounds that I can think of that females make that males don't make. And that is, well, I'll have that sound coming up here, that knocking sound. I was wondering what it would sound like with a microphone. It's a little bit like, it's not a bird sound so much as a knocking sound. A little bit like knocking on a door. Maybe I should try that. Oh, look at that. That's good. Yeah. Okay, John Scott. He'll give us lessons during the break. So, just seeing the next slide, I remember to add the fact that it's one of the largest passerines in the world. I think the average weight for ravens around the world is about 2.5 pounds, but they go up to 4 pounds, and that might be subspecies. There are 8 subspecies of ravens, so there's variability in different gene flows around the world. But with this average of 2.6 pounds, they aren't quite as large as the average as the thick-billed raven, which is this bird, which is in the Horn of Africa, which is where Victor and Libby are right now. So maybe they're seeing thick-billed ravens, and those are seriously thick-billed for sure. And their average weight is 3.3 pounds, and they go well over 4. But our common raven will go over 4 as well. So they're very close. You know, close race for the largest passerines on the planet. Rave on, rave on. This is a raven, and the bill gives it away, but also the neck feathers. I particularly like this picture because of the close-up of the neck feathers, which are an unusual shape. Most feathers aren't pointed like that, but these feathers have evolved this shape because they are used in communication with the raven's social group to communicate status, actually. They swell them out in the same way we could easily think of blue grouse hooting and puffing out their necks and their neck feathers and their air sac. We see that so commonly in the spring. The ravens do that regularly with their neck feathers. They puff them way out. I have a picture coming up. And it's shockingly critical in animals, social animals, to be able to communicate your sense of place in that group. And also, it gets a little uncomfortable, I think, for us when we realize that how closely related we are to other vertebrates, and we see this kind of behavior in ourselves. But it's also informative. It really does inform us a lot about the human condition. But that's Wednesday night, by the way, when we review People's History of the United States at the education station, if you're interested. But these things are not unrelated. They are not. And reading about ravens is a little bit disappointing because it's such a tightly bound social structure with no real flexibility. The most powerful and confident bird rules the social situation. And that means that the dominant bird has the primary access to all the resources, mostly food, but in reproductive season to the female of choice. And it's true, as far as I know, throughout the animal kingdom. It's not a bad thing, but in terms of reconciling all that with human behavior, it's a little more challenging. So these birds, in wild, they live 15 or 20 years, which is quite a long time for a bird to live. And under human care, like at the Tower of London, where they're fed and cared for, they've been known to live for 40 years. So a sketch of looking at the differences between crows and ravens. Well, that crow beak is not all that different than a raven beak. You just don't get that sense of kind of almost gargantuan size you get in this picture, in that drawing. You don't get that sense from a crow. But if there's just a crow and not a raven to compare it can be a little difficult. But look at the neck. That drawing shows some of the difference in the neck. In the drawing, the raven feathers look a little puffed out. They might not always be so clear. But it's two things to look for among several of things. I think the next one. Here's a displaying. I assume this is a male, but females will do this as well. But it's a daunting picture. It's not just, so they fluff out various parts of their body. They have these throat feathers that they can expand. They fluff, it says that they expand the fluff, fuzz on their head. I don't quite see that in this picture, but apparently some feathers will go up on the head, the wings will go out, the tail will expand, and the problem with all that is, so you've got this daunting figure that you're looking at, and then there's these two little stick legs coming down out of the bird that sort of are a mockery of the strength of the bird. So, what the raven has evolved over time is it also has kind of bloomers made out of feathers, that it also expands these bloomers around these funny little stick legs that it has. And it communicates to the other ravens its sense of its own power. And there may be a comparable display with another male, and they'll decide who exhibited the greatest force, and that bird will be the dominant bird until there's a challenge. There's a raven tail with fan-shaped. It'd be quite a bit more straight, not completely straight, but not so fan-shaped. And we do have a drawing there. So the raven tail, when it's not expanded, is wedge-shaped. The drawing on the left there, crows are closer to straight across, and then when the raven expands its tail, it becomes more fan-shaped. So it's a gradation. It's not the simplest thing in the world to figure out, but when you add all these up, I think, in the classic language of the birders, you'll get a jizz, which I forget what that stands for, but it's a feeling. You get a feeling, that's a raven, and that's a crow, from knowing these somewhat subtle differences between the two birds. So corvids are smart, and what does that mean that they're smart? They exhibit intelligence in different ways, and one of the most striking examples of the intelligence of corvids is this New Caledonian crow, which makes its own tools. It makes two kinds of tools. It makes this tool, which it has fashioned this tool. It broke the stick off, and I don't think it put that hook on there, but it broke the stick off at just the right point to get the hook right where it wants it, and uses it to probe in holes and pull out insect larvae. So it's definitely a tool using bird, which is pretty rare. And it makes another tool out of a leaf, a particular leaf that grows in New Caledonia that has barbs on the edge of the leaf, and it shapes the end of the leaf. It's a fairly stiff leaf. It shapes the end of the leaf into a spear. So it turns this leaf into a spear with barbs on the edge, and it's a stepped process. It doesn't do it all at once. It has to shape this leaf in several steps. That reminds me of images I have seen of when our genus Homo first started to create tools. That would be like Homo habilis, which means handyman, they only, the stone tools that Homo habilis made were only struck 10 to 20 times. They were very simple tools. I mean, you're talking about taking one rock and hitting it with another rock and shaping it into a crude blade of some kind. That's a stepped creation of a tool. The New Caledonian Crow does the same thing. It creates its own tools through a series of steps. So it has to have some sense, somehow, at the beginning of the process of what it wants to end up with. So it's a sense of looking into the future and imagination that these birds apparently have. So this is the New Caledonian Crow, and there's not fully equivalent behavior with our common raven, but there's other indications of these qualities of brain power, foresight, and imagination. A graph of, this is a graph comparing the actual, the ratio of the brain to the brain stem. So remember that we often consider the brain stem to be what we call the reptilian brain stem. Reptiles have a brain stem but almost no brain. And reptiles do not, there's probably no reptile that exhibits discretionary behavior that isn't just programmed by its DNA. It just reacts to the environment in a way that it has been chemically programmed to react through evolution. But somehow the larger the forebrain, the brain that forms on top of the reptilian brainstem, the larger that is in a ratio to the brainstem, the more potential there is for contemplating behavior, thinking about behavior and what will serve you the best. And so that graph shows comparison of how the ratio of brain to brainstem grows is greatest in the last two are corvids, and just have a lot of brain compared to brainstem, and show the most adaptable and discretionary behavior of all the birds, except some parrots are quite similar. So here's a somewhat famous experimental example of a corvid showing intelligence, and this is the European magpie, which was not too long ago split. I think that our red magpie, I remember in my older bird books, it's Pica pica, and now it's Pica hudsonia. They split it away from the European magpie on a genetic basis, that the genes are a little different, and that our black-billed magpie is more similar to the yellow-billed magpie in California than it is to the European magpie, so the taxonomists felt like they had to split the two. Anyhow, they're very similar, as you can see. And experiments were done with this magpie, putting it in front of a mirror and assessing its behavior in front of the mirror compared to other animals and other birds. Well, most animals, when they see their own image in a mirror, think that they are seeing another animal. They don't have the imagination and depth of inquiry to realize that that creature is moving with its exact movements, and it's actually seeing a reflection of itself. So, let's see, where does this, oh yeah. So, they put these yellow marks, well, they put several marks on a magpie. This one has a yellow mark on it. They put a red mark. They put it just below the bill, which is, it's a blind spot for the bird, so that the bird cannot, on itself, it cannot see that red spot. And they put it in front of a mirror. So I pulled out, it reminded me of this stuff I'd seen by Piaget doing the same experiment with human beings. So here's a maybe 45-second video. I'm not sure how the volume's going to be. Oops, sorry. What do I have to do? I have to click this. Go, baby. You can do it.
Usually, a baby younger than about 18 months doesn't make the connection between itself and the person in the mirror. The child may even look behind the mirror for the stranger it sees.
Hi. Hi.
But by about 18 months, there's a change in the child's awareness.
And that changes that he realizes that he's looking at himself or herself. And this is what they found, that especially the European magpie had the capacity to recognize, in contrast to almost all the other birds that were tested, had the capacity to recognize itself in the mirror. So some level of self-recognition there, like that. And it showed up, here's a little graphic of the behaviors exhibited by the magpie. It looked in the mirror, and it saw that the magpie in the mirror had a mark on its neck. And it was able to realize that that was itself, that was a reflection of itself, and it started to go after that mark on its neck. It went after it with its beak, which often it couldn't reach with its beak, and then it went after it with its foot, and it scraped that mark off of there. Now, most birds, as some of you have probably seen, and I've experienced this a number of times, most birds, when they see themselves in the mirror, react like this. They think that it's a competitor. They think that it's a male competitor that looks almost as powerful as itself, and it'll beat itself almost to death on that mirror. I've seen them go at it for 20 minutes and beat the mirror and beat themselves to a pulp, poop on the mirror, and try to get rid. They never get any sense that it is not themselves that they are seeing. So there's a bluebird, a cardinal, and then some birds, when they look in the mirror, have delusions of grandeur, which again you can see the equivalency with Homo sapiens there. So, intelligence. This is a large flock of ravens at a wolf kill with some kind of ungulate cut open there and a wolf at the site. And so for any of you who have read Heinrich, what seems like one of his very insightful discoveries, what he noticed was that a raven would, when two ravens landed at a feeding site, some kind of ungulate that was down on the ground and opened up, because ravens cannot open the hide of an ungulate, a deer, or an elk. They can't cut it open. They have to have something else do it. It has to be a coyote, a wolf, or an eagle, or a vulture can open those, but they can't do it. So they have to have these animals come in. So they would notice. So Heinrich noticed long ago, this is like 1985 or so, or even earlier, that when two ravens landed at a feeding site, they were silent. But when one landed, it raised an enormous ruckus, and he couldn't understand why, when this raven had all this food to himself, or herself, that they would make this noise that would attract other ravens, and sure enough, other ravens would come. And what turned out to be the case is that if there's two ravens, it's a mated pair, and they are the dominant territorial pair in that area, and they won't let the unmated, which are generally younger and less forceful creatures, they won't let the younger ravens feed at the site. So the only way for the younger ravens to gain access to a dead animal is to call in reinforcements. And so if they can call in 10 birds, they can overpower the territorial pair. And that was considered a powerful form of intelligence because, well, they were calling them in there, but another thing they'll do is they go to a roost site. One raven that knows of a food source will go to a roost site, and the next day, all the ravens in the roost will follow that raven to the food. So somehow that raven has been able to communicate to the larger community of ravens that there's food available. What's that called, Jenny? It's called displacement. Well, we were laughing about how hard it was to remember that term. So this is a graphic out of a study on corvid intelligence compared with primate intelligence. And the general sense that these scientists got was that often corvid intelligence is about equivalent to non-human primate intelligence. And in fact, they've done that mirror test. They've done that mirror test with primates, and chimpanzees are able to recognize that they are seeing themselves in the mirror, but gorillas are not. That's kind of a generalization, but it wasn't because it wasn't quite all gorillas. I mean, all chimpanzees did not succeed in recognizing that they were seeing themselves, but they had that capacity in the same way that the European magpie did. So they came up with these terms identifying different kinds of intelligence which are not as all that different in the long term. So they have this thing up there called causal reasoning. That would be cause and effect, that if I perform a certain action, it will have a predictable effect in the future. And what they show up there is a scrub jay. Well, scrub jays turn out to be a big story that I wasn't fully aware of. We know, locally we know that our Clark's nutcrackers cache whitebark pine seeds by the thousands and thousands when they're available. I've heard that they cache 33,000 pine seeds. No, really, I said 30,000. I think maybe it was Jenny said no. Somebody said no, 33,000. But they cache, Clark's nutcrackers cache these whitebark pine seeds in hundreds of caches and are able to find, I don't know the number, who knows, at least 75% of those caches, a large number of those caches. They remember them for 6 months, where they put these pine seeds. There's some cause and effect there, but the scrub jay caches not only food that doesn't spoil, but caches food that will spoil. And so it has to be able to remember what kind of food it cached where and how long that food will last before it's inedible, and it succeeds in doing that. So there's a lot of cause and effect brain capacity there, and that's why they show this probably scrub jay stashing food up there. Imagination over in the red on the right. The classic example for the corvids is Heinrich's experiment of hanging meat on a string. And this is a completely unnatural situation for a raven to experience. If it wants that meat, it's going to have to figure out how to get at it, and the only way to get at it is to pull that string up. And 4 out of 5 ravens in Heinrich's experiments figured out. They were able to imagine that if they pulled the string up and held it with their foot, and then pulled it up again and held it with their foot, and they did that 4 or 5 times, they would get the meat. That's considered imagination, flexibility, and prospection. Prospection means the ability to look into the future and think about, and again, think about where you're going to put your food or how you're going to access food. The chimpanzee has picked up a stone. It's going to carry that stone with it and going to use that stone to crack open some food source. So it's projecting into the future its actions in the moment. But all these are, as I said, this is all concerned with eating, not getting eaten, and reproducing. So here's some pictures of a raven, one of Heinrich's marked ravens, pulling up the meat. And as I say, 4 out of 5, very quickly, within minutes, we're able to figure out this process, even though no programming, no genetic programming for this behavior. You never find this situation in nature, and no previous training. And they just looked the situation over, were able to use their large forebrain and figure out how to behave. And here, I think this is a short clip that I think actually very briefly has Heinrich in it. So I was delighted to see Heinrich in action, see what he looks like. And I think this, I haven't looked at this for a little while, but I think it's, they actually have the ravens pulling up on the cord here. Oh, sorry. It went to the next one.
Crows and ravens are the stuff of myths and legends, and according to some scientists, are among the smartest of birds, even more savvy than many mammals.
when you watch them, you kind of sense an awareness and alertness. Then you watch them some more and you see them play, engage in behaviors that seem to be made just for the fun of it.
Dr. Bernd Heinrich of the University of Vermont has gone to great lengths to study these fascinating birds. More than a decade ago, he devised an experiment that demonstrated that ravens have the ability to make logical connections, much like human beings. Heinrich tied meat to a string and dangled it from a branch. It was a situation ravens would never encounter in the wild. But, as with this first-timer, some ravens figured out how to pull the string in loops and anchor it with their claws, until the meat was theirs.
You couldn't have learned it because I didn't train him. You couldn't have been programmed to do it by evolution through millions of years because in the natural habitat you don't have that. And it couldn't have been random chance because there are too many individual steps. So it was very suggestive that the bird knew what it was doing.
Ravens exhibit other behavior that suggests innate intelligence. They will hide food for later consumption. And if one raven thinks another is watching, it will pretend to hide it in one place while actually hiding it in another. But the hoard of food is found and stolen. It's hard to outsmart a raven, even for another raven. They are, after all, very brainy birds.
The thinking seems to go that these social interactions, which are based on survival and accessing food in the company of other animals of the same species, is what drove the evolution of the brain, the larger brain, because of all this stimulation, constant stimulation from your flock mates in the case of birds or pack mates in the case of mammals. The constant social interaction led to a constant increase in the power of the brain to create different scenarios and work with different scenarios, like they just mentioned. Ravens cache a lot of food, but if they cache it in the presence of other ravens, the one raven will watch the other raven, and when first raven leaves, the other raven will go over and dig it up. So now ravens have figured out that they can pretend to cache food and dig a hole and stuff something in there and cover it up and walk away. And they might actually have the food in their gular pouch, which is not visible, and then they bury it somewhere else. So it's been described as an arms race, actually, that the individuals are all trying to optimize their own reproductive success, which means getting enough to eat, and it's driven the development of the brain. So this is another short video that shows, this is, I think, National Geographic's a little bit dramatized and quite charming, but I think it's probably a true story of a raven that figured out it could pull up on a fishing line and get the fish at the end of the line.
One story comes from Scandinavia, a curious case of a recurring theft. Deep in midwinter, a fisherman sets his line through a hole in the ice, leaving it unattended in the cold. But in the trees nearby, a raven sits watching and realizes exactly what the stick and line are for. Reeling in the line with beak and foot, the raven steals the catch, day after day. The The fisherman can scarcely believe his eyes when he finally discovers the identity of the thief.
So there's a view of a passeriform, 3 toes forward, 1 toe backwards. As I say, the largest order of birds by far among the birds, and they do have this cute trick of when they bend at the knees, it pulls on a tendon that causes the toes to contract, so that when they go to sleep, the foot automatically clings onto the branch, and they don't have to in any way consciously manage that process. Ravens generally mate for life, except for extramarital affairs, which we run into all the time in the bird world. I notice that it comes up regularly. But they do keep the same mate for as long as possible, and then just the fact that extra mate copulations have been documented, and it would be when the male's away, the female's maybe on the nest or at the nest site. The male leaves, and a vagrant bird will fly in, and I presume the female is receptive to the copulation, but it does occur. But beyond that, it's a pair of ravens for a lifetime, and the behavioral characteristics that they display in building that relationship and then maintaining and renewing that relationship on a yearly basis are one of the things that we actually see regularly in the spring when we see 2 birds flying along and one or both of them are displaying to the other one. And one, certainly, the acrobatics that ravens display are often associated with mating. So when 2 ravens are flying along and one turns upside down and then turns right back up again, it's either working to create a pair bond or it's reinforcing the pair bond that had existed in the past. They'll begin to form pairs after a year or 2, but to actually nest requires nesting territory, and that requires food resources, which often are not easy to find. And so territories are at a premium. And a lot of birds will go 4 years, 5 years, 6 years without ever nesting because they don't have nesting territory. They might even be mated, but they don't lay eggs because there's not enough food. They're driven out of available territories by the dominant birds in that area. Here's some displaying, and it seems to be part of the bonding process. If you have, you should not try this at home, but apparently it's with ravens. It's part of the bonding process. You have to be able to fly upside down and show your mate that you can do that. Here's I think they're both upside down in this picture. So there's a classic view of a raven with the wedge-shaped tail and the widespread primaries and the thick neck, and is obviously beginning nest building. So once they're mated and there is a territory, they build a stick nest, and the nesting area can be used for a very long time, like 100 years, which would be multiple generations of ravens. It would be a nesting area. The same nest might be used year after year. More often they have 2 nests or 3 nests, and they move between the nests, which I've seen our golden eagles do that in Pipestone. I've seen that there was a time where I knew they had 3 nests. The golden eagles had 3 nests in Pipestone, and they would use a different nest every year. I don't see them doing that so much these days, but apparently ravens do the same thing, and it might possibly be, among other things, avoidance of nest parasites that would build up in the nest if you leave it for a year or two. So then they start, so the nest will be there. After they've built a nest, it'll be there for years, and if one sees sticks, new fresh sticks appearing in the nest, it probably means that they're going to use it that year. Either mate can build the nest, probably more often the female, but sometimes the male will take the lead in building the nest. The nest itself is built with sticks. Oh, they break the sticks off. They don't like sticks from the ground. They break the sticks off from branches, and if they drop it, they don't pick it up. So I don't know what the explanation for that is. Maybe they don't like going down to the ground. Maybe that's a little insecure for them. I don't know, but that's the word. They built this big stick nest, and then they line it with much softer material, such as bark and mud and roots, and then they line that with animal fur. So there's a view inside nest with the eggs laid. After they build the nest, they leave it. They don't lay the eggs immediately. And I've seen this somewhere else in birds. I forget where. I have a lot of bluebird boxes up, and I think I have experienced that in bluebird boxes, where the bluebirds will build the nest, and then there's no eggs. There's no eggs for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then the eggs appear. So ravens do the same thing, and I would assume that it's a means of checking out the security of the area. They put this big sign up that there's going to be a nesting activity there, and then they want to see what kind of other bird activity there is in the area. Then they lay 3 to 7 eggs, and they start incubating with the second to the last egg, which is interesting in that means that the last egg will hatch a day or two later than the rest, and will always be a little smaller and a little weaker, and could easily become sacrificed to inadequate food supply. That happens with eagles. A couple of us watched golden eagles 2 years ago up at, actually it was on Eagle Rocks at Bocky Hill, and Victor and Libby were involved in that. I showed them this nest that we could get up on the rocks and look down into the nest. And of course, once I showed them the nest, then they spent the rest of the week up there looking at that nest, and I got a call from them on their cell phone, said, "You have to come up here. There's a fawn in the nest." So probably the female golden eagle had been able to lift a newborn fawn 60 feet up in this Douglas fir tree. There were 2 eaglets. One was, and those are laid, well, the incubation begins with the first egg, and there's 1 or 2 day break. So the second eaglet is always weaker than the first. And the second eaglet was, in the case that we watched, was extremely shy and fearful of the first one. And they grew to about half size, and then we went up there one time, and the smaller eaglet was dead and probably eaten by the larger eagle, because even though there had been a fawn in the nest, there wasn't enough food. That illustrates this phenomenon of beginning incubation before the last egg is laid. And for some reason, ravens might lay 6 eggs, but they start incubating with the 5th egg. And it gives them just this outlet that if there's not enough food, one of those young ravens is clearly going to be the weakest one and will just die. Might even get eaten by the young ones, but it would. They don't seem to have that much insight into the importance of family relations, shall we say. It does remind me, too, of stories Heinrich told where, so about a bird intelligence. Well, they are intelligent, and they display it in some of the interesting ways that we've already looked at. But Heinrich then thought, well, just how intelligent are they about their nest? So he climbed a tree, huge tree, and put a chicken egg in the nest. And there was no response on the part of the 2 adult ravens. They could not tell that this white egg was a chicken egg, and they incubated it. And so then he climbed back up and he put an Easter egg in there, a red Easter egg, and there was no response to that either. They began to incubate the red Easter egg. So then he put a film canister in, filled with water, so it had about the weight of an egg, and they chucked that out of the nest. But that's a fascinating thing with birds, that whatever level of intelligence they have intelligence that works for life as they're expected to experience it, one could say. They are such good guardians of their nest that they don't expect nest predators, they don't expect nest parasites, like cowbirds or cuckoos. You know, we have cowbirds. We had one cuckoo. A yellow-billed cuckoo was seen last year in the Methow. Yellow-billed cuckoos are nest parasites. So they'd be a larger egg. They might be a candidate to lay an egg in a raven nest, but they don't tend to do that because ravens guard their nests assiduously. So they are programmed to, in any way, genetically, to monitor their eggs. So they can't tell the difference between an Easter egg and their own egg. And that doesn't seem that bright to me. And you know how true that is for the other birds that we've learned about, that when the cowbirds lay eggs in a warbler's nest, the warblers never know. And the cowbird egg is twice the size of a warbler egg. And it hatches quickly. It hatches 8 days or something like that. And the cowbird throws out the warbler eggs. It'll push them out of the nest. Or if they all hatch, the cowbird is twice the size of the warbler babies, and the parent can't tell. It's just astonishing the power of programming and the lack of insight. Pardon me, but I'm shocked. So, here's two ravens on a nest. I'm thinking they're adults. I'm not sure. It looks like there's a third raven in there. Well, maybe they aren't. But we're taking them for adults because it's the female that incubates the eggs. The male does not incubate, but on the rare cases the female leaves the nest, the male goes to the nest and guards it. He stands over the eggs. He can't incubate them, but he guards them. And they are fierce guardians of their nest. They'll drive away all predators that come along that might try to take the eggs or the nestlings. Babies hatch after 20 days. They're in the nest after that for 40 days, so it's quite a long nesting period. The parents bring in food, obviously, and at first they tear up the food, and later they'll just leave chunks of food in the nest, and the babies tear it apart and feed themselves or the nestlings. At 40 days they fledge, but they retain their pink mouth, and there's an interesting anecdote about the pink mouth, and that is that a raven will retain the pink lining of its mouth until it becomes a dominant bird, as long as it's submissive to the other birds around it. So it could be a year old, a year and a half old, could be 2 years old, it would still have this pink lining. It's not until it becomes dominant in the context of the other ravens around that it loses that pink lining. Flocking and roosting behavior. Ravens roost together. They form large roosts all year. Those would be non-territorial birds, birds that aren't paired and or don't have a territory. They roost together, and part of the reason they do that is the reason I explained before. It offers some way to counter the power of a mated pair and the territoriality of a mated pair. They can, if there's enough juvenile ravens, they can drive the mated pair off of a carcass. So here's, this is the kind of thing we often see in the Methow, two ravens flying together, and they're going to almost always be a mated pair. You can see this all the time, actually, in Twisp against the cliffs there, where the old mill site, where the mill used to be. Ravens fly there all the time, all year long. That's also the hill with the T on it. So here's a chance, you can see the difference in the size of these birds, and you can pick out the male. Is that true? Can you tell which one's bigger? I mean, I would say the one on your left is clearly a larger bird and is the male. They're not going to be enormously bigger. And actually, so there's a sound here. I forget what it is. Let's see. It's going to get better. This is the knocking sound of the female. So, the interesting thing about that knocking sound, the interesting thing about that knocking sound is only the female makes it. Now, I've heard that at home when they fly overhead. I've regularly heard that knocking sound, and I was not aware until recently that only the female makes that sound, and so that's one way to tell male from female, is when you hear that sound. And they'll use that as part of the female display, and they'll puff up their throat and use that as almost a weapon against other females to establish dominance among females. So that occurs with females. Establishment of dominance exists in the same way that it does with males. So I put that in. Boy, it's just the right time to take a short break. Good Lord, he's putting like 4 calves and 3 deer and a moose and 2 groundhogs. He just has all this meat that he puts out constantly. Now, surely I can find something. So I was watching, and this was a mule deer that was killed, hit by a car, not an uncommon occurrence. And I brought it home and took it. I brought it home, it was about 8 days ago, and probably 10 days ago now, and I put it under the pine tree that was 60 feet in front of the house. And I guess I didn't cut it open and left it there, and the only thing that came to it were magpies. No eagles came to it. Now the river is down below my house on the other side of the house, and I know that they'll come to a carcass there because I had one there once before. In any case, I thought that it was under a pine tree. It was 60 feet from the house. I thought that birds would come to it, and actually, so mostly magpies came. An eagle never landed. One raven landed. So ravens are famous for having this behavioral phenomenon that Heinrich calls neophobia. They're afraid of what's new. They're afraid of things that are new that they don't understand. And so I've read about it repeatedly, and by gosh, did they ever exhibit it. And one way that they exhibit it is the magpies just land by a carcass and they fight with one another for dominance, and they walk up and they start pecking at the carcass. The raven landed 10 feet from this carcass when it was under the pine tree, and then they start doing this behavior. I think I'd read about it first, and now I've seen it a number of times. They'll hop towards the carcass, and then they act like they've been bitten, and they hop back. And then they hop forward, and they hop back, and it's very comical. I almost got it on film, but I didn't really know how to use my movie camera. It's just a regular digital camera, and I never used the movie aspect, and so it didn't record it. But I had this shot of them hopping forward and backwards, and then it flew away, and it never went to the carcass. And so after 4 days, nothing came. So then I dragged this thing down to the river, and I left it there for 2 days, and nothing came. And so I had to open it up myself with a kitchen knife. Now, so ravens can't open a large carcass, as I mentioned. They need a larger bird or a predatory mammal to do it with big teeth. So I went down with a kitchen knife, and I opened it up. And then I started getting quite a number of bald eagles. So there were eagles and magpies at this carcass. Probably I think there's an eagle here. So this was taken with a remote camera that I put on a post down there, and that was the first time I ever got any pictures. They're really very enjoyable once you learn how to use them to start getting remote pictures. And this I actually took from the house with a telephoto lens. But it was very difficult to get a magpie to land because I can't get the story straight, except that they're neophobes. It didn't look right to the ravens. The ravens were there. They flew over every day. I mean, regularly. I could see them flying over. They looked down. They didn't look nervous. They would land in the trees. I could see them land in the trees, but they almost never came to the carcass. And here, this is a picture I got off the web, but it's what they look like when they're jumping up in the air. They bound up in the air, they extend their wings, and they either bounce forward or backwards. And I've seen them do this a number of times, and Heinrich writes about it. It's a regular behavior of a certain phobia of a situation that they're not comfortable with. Now, I can't really quite grasp why that behavior exists in ravens. As a dominant bird in the way that they are, they have very few predators. I don't know, you'll have to use your own imagination. As couple of us talked about during the break, you know, it's possible if it's a large hoofed animal, it might not be dead. So it's typical that they would wait for the magpies or crows to go to the carcass and test it, and then if they were on it and it was safe, they would go to it. If they still didn't trust it, then the dominant bird, this is what Heinrich says, will have the subordinate birds go. And then if it looks safe, he'll go kick the subordinate birds off and take control of the carcass himself. And it's quite remarkable the way power plays out in the animal world. So then this is taken with the remote camera, the automatic camera, and I'm just going to I think there's maybe 4 or 5 shots here, but this guy just sort of moved around. It wasn't too comfortable, but finally went to the carcass, and I do read that the dominant bird will stand on the carcass. So I guess they both thought they were dominant, and it did finally feed. But that was the only occasion in a week that I had ravens land at this carcass. This is a raven feeding on something. So one of the remarkable aspects of ravens is how omnivorous they are. They'll eat anything you can name that's edible, they'll eat. So I was trying to memorize the list. So if you could start with worms, they eat grain, they eat fruit, they eat tomatoes, vegetables, they eat worms, they eat carrion maggots and beetles, and any other insect. They eat rodents, which they would kill a rodent if they can get any rodent, you know, a shrew or a mouse or a vole. They certainly kill squirrels, kill rabbits, which are not quite rodents. They eat garbage. They eat dog and wolf poop. And they eat cookies, and they eat Cheetos. They're famous for loving Cheetos. Alexis told me, I didn't take a picture of it, but Alexis told me they love Cheetos, and I think maybe Heinrich had said that. So I bought a bag of Cheetos, which I was pretty embarrassed because I wasn't getting anything else, so I was just buying Cheetos. And I'll tell you what, the cashier, I could tell you her name, and you would know who she is, but she said, oh my God, those are my new addiction, Cheetos. I feel so bad. So she was eating Cheetos, and I said, I'm buying these for my ravens, I'm not buying them. I couldn't stand to have her thing. And then the raven didn't touch them, and I had to eat them. And I want you to know they're not as good as I remembered. So no, they're famous for eating ravens. I put a little bowl of ravens out there at the carcass, and nobody ever touched it. Cheetos, what'd I say?
Ravens.
Yeah, gotta watch me, I run down easily. So let's see, I forget, the next picture. So there's some controversy over how hazardous ravens are as predators of other creatures, especially, say, our other nesting birds. And in reading, I got mixed reports because there was a big study done, and it's available online, and I read it. And they did an overview of 42 studies of raven and crow predation, or maybe it was corvid predation. And their assessment was it's really not a serious problem in the natural world, that corvids do predate on other birds. They definitely eat eggs. They'll steal eggs if they can find them and if they can get them, but they aren't great at finding them and getting them. That was the summary of this published scientific report. But then, probably in Heinrich or somewhere else, there's stories of ravens eating many things, including a story of them from Alaska of a raven hitting a kittiwake, which is like a small gull, hitting a kittiwake in the air, knocking it out of the air, and going to the ground and killing it and eating it. Of dragging kittiwakes off their nest and stealing their eggs, their ground nesters, of several ravens attacking geese and killing the geese. So big birds, they work together to kill larger animals. So they're certainly not beyond some serious predation on, they'll eat anything that's edible. And if they can kill it, they'll eat it. So there is some question about whether ravens are implicated in our loss of sharp-tailed grouse. Because sharp-tailed grouse are ground nesters and nested probably in the bunch grass. I'm not sure if it was in the grass or under the bitterbrush. The same way, though, that our blue grouse nest, or similar. But, you know, there were a lot of sharp-tailed grouse. Right, Carl?
Yeah, but a long time ago.
A long time ago, but in the 70s. I have read that in the 70s there were up to 5,000 sharp-tailed grouse in the Methow. There's not one anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time. And as I will talk about at the end of this program, the number of ravens is exponentially greater than it used to be. So there's a possible connection there. The other thing about sharp-tailed grouse is their favorite winter food was water birch buds. And I think water birch, which is that nice birch tree that grows in our riparian areas, is probably the very best firewood in the Methow Valley. And it may have been cut out in a big way. Carl, what do you think? Carl didn't bite. Not in the creek bottom. Not a lot of it, or not cut out? Mm-hmm. Well, anyhow, the point being, they are nest predators, and there's controversy over how much impact they have on other nesting birds. But somewhere I read, so, you know, magpies go to great lengths to build their domed nests. In fact, they'll take up to 40 days to build those domed nests, and a raven has been seen deconstructing the dome and pulling the nestlings out one at a time. Well, you know, the magpies could only stand aside and complain. So that's been seen to happen. It's a dangerous world, no doubt about it. So ravens form relationships with other animals. They're around bald eagles a lot. For one thing, bald eagles can open those carcasses that ravens can't open, so they might even follow bald eagles, but mostly what they seem to do is harass bald eagles. And it's often the case that smaller birds harass larger birds, especially larger predators. So you've probably seen ravens will regularly fly after, they'll go out of their way to chase bald eagles. And they regularly, when a bald eagle is feeding at a carcass, they'll go behind the bald eagle and pull on its tail. And I saw magpies do that at that carcass I had at my house previously a couple of years ago. It was very entertaining. Well, come to find out, corvids do that regularly, and that ravens will do it with wolves. They'll regularly pull on wolves' tails. It seems like they're asking for trouble, but... So the ravens harass the eagles, and this is a crow harassing a raven, because the larger animals are almost always predatory on the smaller animals, and so if the smaller animal has a chance, it will harass and chase away the larger animal. That's an upside-down raven about to be hit by a crow. Ravens and wolves. So I think it's maybe a fairly recent understanding of how tightly bound these animals are. And of course, it would be hard to observe this in the lower 48 because the wolves were all gone from the lower 48, mostly all gone, certainly gone from Washington, gone from Yellowstone. I think they were reintroduced into Yellowstone in about 95. But there is a tight relationship between wolves and ravens. Ravens follow wolves all the time because wolves bring down large animals and then don't eat them all. Don't eat the whole animal. And they're capable of opening the animals. So ravens follow wolves. There's some sense that ravens may alert wolves to where a large ungulate is. May be able to lead a wolf to a moose. That was sort of inconclusive, but a possibility. So people got onto this connection, and once again, Heinrich and joined with several other scientists and went to Yellowstone not so long ago, I forget, 10 or 12 years ago, and did a study of the relationships between ravens and wolves. And they were able to watch wolf pursuit of mammals, wolf kills. I think they documented 29 kills And I think maybe it was the case that in 24 of those kills, the ravens were on the carcass within 1 minute. And in the other 4 or 5 cases, they were on the carcass within a very short period of time. So then Heinrich, he was there in elk hunting season. The elk hunters were gutting these elk and leaving the entrails out in the hills. And so he'd get information from the hunters on where the entrails was, and he was able to document 16 sites of these entrails lying out in the woods. There was never a single raven on any of the entrails. So the ravens were clearly working with and associated with the wolves. Not only that, they did, if there was just meat and no reason for it, they didn't trust it. They had neophobia, and they wouldn't eat it. And I would say that I experienced that at that carcass that I put out, which is still out there. No ravens come to it except for those one I showed a picture of, 2 actually. So here they are communicating about the location of a meat supply. So the contemplation is that this could be an ancient relationship, that ravens have probably been following wolves for millions of years, and that it may be a symbiotic relationship in some way. It's clearly beneficial to the ravens. One of the conjectures was that at a kill site, and this has been observed, that the ravens are much more jumpy and watchful than the wolves, and so the ravens may serve as an early warning system for the wolves if something's going wrong at the kill site. Anyhow, they're closely tied together, and sometimes ravens are called wolf birds. Now there are certain dangers. There's dangers in feeding with wolves, and they'll feed right next to the wolves, but keep some respectable distance. Wolves will chase ravens away, they'll get irritated at the ravens, and there have been a few dead ravens found at wolf kill sites. Almost surely killed by the wolves, but then not consumed because there's already meat there. Other dangers. So there are predators that pursue ravens. The big ones, so the ones we could guess at: bald eagles, golden eagles, red-tailed hawks, and great horned owls. But ravens are so pugnacious that it's rarely documented to see an adult raven taken by a predator. Young, yes; adults, rare. So this looks like a sad case of a dead raven, but in fact it's a raven that was rolling in the snow, which ravens do regularly. They play in the snow, they'll roll down roofs, they'll roll down hills, and this just happens to be a still shot of a raven that I used for a dead raven. I think I have here, let's see, yeah, this is, some of you may have seen this, a charming little video taken in Russia of a Eurasian crow, which may also be a carrion crow, I'm not sure, sliding down a roof in Russia, and these people took this picture from their apartment.
Who's the story? Sweetie. What?
What's on a ring?
I'm not talking to you, Relax. Okay.
So there's pictures, you can Google something, I don't know what it would be, ravens sliding on roofs. There's a picture of them sliding down the roof of the library in Yellowstone and various roofs in various places and rolling over down hills, which looks like play. It looks like play. So people have, on occasion, of course, raised ravens, and they rave about the richness of the experience. I wrote it down. I don't know if I have it here, but people just said, one couple said they could not live without their raven, and said another family said it was the most precious experience of our lives to have this bird involved in their family life because the interactions were so rich. Yeah. So this is another little motion picture that I extracted from something that was quite a bit busier, but I was so impressed with this is slow motion, raven flying in slow motion, and it has a beauty that I think you will enjoy that might escape us at full speed, and just the fact that these animals are actually able to move through the atmosphere, and to think, just to think of the evolutionary journey that life had to evolve onto the land and learn to live on land and inhabit the land, and then life actually moved into the air and became these graceful organisms that could move in the atmosphere is quite an astonishing fact. Oops, sorry. Do that. This is not the movie. It looks like the movie. The movie comes at the end of this. This is Raven Crow ID test. So you have to decide what that is. We already have a consensus. Melanie, that tail, what would you say? Raven. Crow.
Or starling.
Okay, so maybe there's no right or wrong answer here because I can't remember. We got mostly ravens, and I heard somebody say, no, mostly crows, and somebody say raven. I think it's a crow. That's a pretty small bill for a raven. And the bird you don't even get a sense of enormity in the bird the way you do with ravens. And you can compare that with what the raven looks like. So there's raven. Overhead, that's, who said that? I agree. I'm a little confused. The bill looks good, the primaries, but the tail is very crow. I think it has to be a crow. That bill is not big enough to be a raven. But there's some brown there, and that may be, well, now the brown I mentioned is on ravens. This is a crow, and I'm not totally clear, but it may be that immature crows also have some brown on them, or heaven knows where this picture came from. Raven. Yeah, in displaying mode, by the way, with his neck feathers puffed up, his wings slightly expanded, doing a dominance display. Crow. This is on calls. We're moving on to calls, and I wanted to mention that the Druids and the Celts, they lived with these animals, and they actually were able to interpret the meanings of some of their calls. And so what I learned is that if a raven flies directly over your head and it says, "Quack, quack, quack," with a G sound, you're going to have unexpected company. If it says, "Quack, quack, quack," with an N at the end, it will be unwelcome company. And if you get a with a B, a lover will come to call. So it can be very useful to be able to interpret these calls, which is not so easy to do, but here I have some calls for you. And you're supposed to tell me what these are. I think we haven't really talked about calls, but you'll probably be able to tell. Let's see if this works first. Well, with no comparison, it might be hard, but here, check this out. So that's a crow. And the first one was a raven. But I think I'm up to seeing 80 different sounds made by ravens, documented sounds. So, I mean, obviously that's their most common one when they fly over. That's a raven. They're just hilarious. And this is a... So supposedly, you know, the most common calls of a crow, obviously, are caw, caw, caw. But there's a sort of an all clear, almost calm, this one. There's no, you can almost anthropomorphize it. There's no real stress. They're just making noise. You know, the word is they're saying, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. But if there's a predator, it gets more stressed out. There's more pressure behind the same words. And then some other strange sounds. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So I think that amounts to knocking, and that's a female raven. You'll never hear that out of a male. Do it again. But different. They're different knocking sounds. They're not all like this, but they're all similar. It's supposed to be a crow. Oops, that one's supposed to. And last sound, this is just bill snapping on the part of a crow, which I imagine a raven. Well, they definitely snap. Both snap. I don't think it's working. I'm going to go back to the wall. Well, it's so interesting. That one doesn't work. Anyhow, it gives you a sense of the similarity and the differences in their sounds. So one interesting dynamic of ravens is the way in which they've increased, certainly in our area. And I became aware of it from the next slide, which I'll get to, but then I looked in this very interesting book that some of you are well aware of and others may not know of, and to find it now, it's out of print, but who knows, you might be able to find it. It's really quite informative for the birds in the Methow, and has various graphs and charts of their behaviors and nesting times. But this happened, they happened to have this graph of raven sightings over time. And they went up from almost 0 in 63, or 45 maybe in 61, to 600, and then end there at 300 or 400. But I hadn't seen that until checking it recently, just to see that they had documented this increase in ravens. So somebody sent me this book a couple of years ago. It's actually just a little booklet, but it's hardbound, but it's just a bird list. Birds cited by this author, William Dawson, in 1895 is when he was here. He was in Okanagan County for a year. He kept track of all the birds he saw. He saw, guess how many ravens he saw? 0. Not a single raven in a year in the Methow Valley. You cannot go out the door of your house today and not see a raven. I would say it's the most common bird sighted in the Methow today. So the thousands and thousands of ravens that are here today are something new, and almost surely a response to human impacts, because they'll eat anything, and humans have a way of creating piles of food here and there and everywhere. And by the way, this is also considered an act of great intelligence to be able to carry 3 cookies at one time. And Heinrich has several stories about, he heard about a raven that in Alaska, where the pipeline guy was feeding raven donuts. And the raven figured out that he could carry 2 donuts if he put his bill through the first donut and then grabbed the second donut. So he had one around his bill. And so, of course, Heinrich has to experiment, you know, so he started feeding his ravens donuts. And he had a raven that held the donut like a little wash basin horizontally, and then propped the other donut in the hole and was able to carry 2 away. Because, see, the problem is there were 4 ravens and there were 6 donuts. And if you take 1 donut and leave 5, then the other birds will get the donuts. It's all a competition all the time. And so the dominant bird was trying to figure out how to get all 6 donuts. And got 5. Got 5, but didn't get all 6. Anyhow, see, that's takes some thinking to pile up. Or taking Cheetos, favorite food here, and it takes some insight to understand that you have to rip that bag open, and inside will be these yummy, yummy orange little curlicue things. And that does remind me of I remember being down in Baja many, many years ago, and our precious water was in one of those probably, 3-gallon collapsible water jugs. And we got up in the morning and it had a hole in it. And a raven had figured out that it was fresh water inside and punched a hole in it and drunk as much water as he wanted, and the rest ran on the ground. But that's reasonably clever. Ravens at a dump. Ravens are omnivores and will eat anything. And so if there's food spread out at a dump, they'll frequent the dump. Even though you think neophobia might be an issue, I guess they get used to the dump and they learn that it's safe. And they actually reproduce quite successfully. It's been documented in the area of dumps because there's a steady food supply. In fact, their territoriality breaks down and they'll nest much closer to one another because there's a larger food supply. So, the increase in the human population has led to an increase in the raven population. Somewhere I was reading about ravens in the Mojave Desert have increased 16-fold in the last 25 years, 16 times more ravens than it used to be because of human impacts, food left around, dumps, sewage plants, other things like that, and they're becoming a threat to the desert tortoise, the little baby tortoises. The ravens eat the baby tortoises when they're young, and don't really know how to deal with that problem. So here's what I mentioned before. This is just enjoying the beauty of a raven in flight for a minute. It looks so much like it's dancing. That one ended up upside down. Very beautiful to see. So we're close to the end here. I have to see, Mary wants me to end exactly at 8 o'clock.
We have lots of questions. We have lots of questions.
This is, I don't know what it is about Northwest Indian art. It's almost always so attractive to me. And as I was looking at some raven art, this one and the next one, there was Northwest Indian art that I picked out. The Northwest Indians have, of course, probably 15,000 year relationship with ravens on North American coast, they would have known ravens from where they came from across the Bering Land Bridge. They have innumerable tales of relationships between ravens and humans. One of the tales is that ravens are the ones who discovered humans in a clamshell and brought the clamshell to shore and opened it up and let the humans out. It's not known whether that's a true story or not. But they create these beautiful works of art that express their stories. These are passerine tracks in the sand, 3 forward, 1 back, raven tracks in the sand. They're just, ravens are entertaining when they're in our presence and when they leave sign of their passing, as in these tracks, or they're beautiful wing tracks in the snow, which I did not take this picture, but I've seen these tracks out in the snow near my house. A few related to the carcass, but it's a mess out there at the carcass with eagles fighting all the time. Anyhow, beautiful to see the signs of the raven in our life. That's the last picture, and let's see. I looked for a story to tell and found the story of a man, just a simple story of a man who was outside of his house and a raven flew over and the man said, hi there, how you doing? How you doing? And the raven turned around and came back to the man and did a half flip, just acknowledged the man clearly, and then turned back and flew away, started to fly away. And the man said, was pleased with that and said, once again, how are you doing? Hey, how you doing? And the raven came back and did a complete rollover over the man's head and then looked down at him and said, Baka, which means somebody's coming down the driveway, remember that? And flew away. And the man was very pleased. And so, that's it. Let's see what this thing does. Baka, remember? Baka! So there's your raven chart.
Questions?
This original frame of reference between the distinction of large birds and Methow, what percentage are ravens and what percentage are crows?
So what percentage are ravens and what percentage are crows, Carl?
It's almost 100% ravens this time of year. The crows don't come very often unless we can feed in the fields or the haystacks like it rains, or they know it. And so, if you see them singles fly, ravens.
If you see what?
Anything that isn't flocked up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was, I don't think I got, maybe I put that on that little identification sheet, the handout. There was ways to tell ravens from crows, but if you see one bird or 2 birds, it's most likely going to be ravens. If you see a flock of birds, and it doesn't have to be a tight flock, it could be one bird, another bird, another bird, another bird, it's more likely to be crows. You can go on and test them out from there. So Carl's saying, not many crows in the Methow, and I think, yeah, I would certainly agree. So my neighbor, until 2 years ago, grew silage and chopped corn. A big field of chopped corn with a chopper. He'd go through this 6-foot-high corn and chop it, and it would throw some corn on the ground, and the next day there would be 500 to 1,000 crows. There'd be a crow on every fence post, all the way around the 300-acre farm. And I think it was the corn and probably insects chewed up and thrown on the ground. It was just a feast for the crows. And I've even seen a flock of seagulls at that time, too.
Where did the crows come from?
Yeah, how they knew that food would be there, I do not know. I mean, you can see crows in the Methow. So crows are regularly at Peregrine Lake, I'm remembering. They nest at Peregrine Lake every year. They're at Peregrine Lake every year. And the, what's the owl? Long-eared owl. Long-eared owl nests in the old crow nests at Peregrine Lake. It's a big hit that, again, Victor and Libby figured out for us. So crows are around, but mostly they're ravens. That's what I would say.
We used to see all crows and no ravens. When I was a kid here, crows everywhere. When some on Flopsa. But because everybody had a corn chopper,
Yeah.
everybody had feed for the stores, so they were fit, and now they're gone.
Uh-huh.
The ravens did.
So yeah, Carl says, for those over there who can hear, when he was growing up, there were crows everywhere because everybody was chopping corn and throwing food on the ground. And now they're gone. And that is the nature of things, if you haven't noticed. Things change.
Do you think there's any correlation with the early bird studies that were done in Valley with the fact that, you know, for a long time there were no deer in the Valley?
No, what?
Deer.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's a correlation between that particular food and then there were more deer, and I wonder if there's kind of an up and down correlation between the deer and the raven population.
Yeah. Did everybody hear Roxy? Wondering if there's a correlation between the changes in the deer population and the changes in the raven population. And I had to read about it, but maybe Carl and or Roxy experienced it. But I've read at the turn of the 1900s, there were almost no deer in the valley. There's a story that I saw in the historical magazine magazine where people woke up in December in Twisp and there were deer tracks, one set of deer tracks through the town, and every hunter in the town got his gun and went after that deer because nobody'd seen a deer for weeks in the Methow. So the deer population is just enormously larger than it was, and I would assume that's because the bottleneck of winter has been mitigated by human actions, the plowing of the roads that lead to the alfalfa fields. You know, I drive by Pruitt's, and I drove by Pruitt's on the way here. They have this big flatbed trailer that they haul big rolls of hay, and there were 5 deer up on the trailer when I drove by, and about 10 down on the ground, you know, cleaning up the little hay, which will allow them to get through this otherwise rather difficult winter. So, ravens, the more food there is available, the more ravens there will be. There are vastly more dead deer on the roads, certainly now when there's so much traffic, and that's one of the sources for food for the deer. And of course, not to mention the bald eagles, which also weren't here, at least in the 70s, there weren't really any bald eagles. There might have been in the early 60s before DDT took them out.
You know anything about like winter and summer migration? We're only here in the winter time. Are the ravens still down low, or any information about that?
I would say ravens don't tend to migrate. They would only move when forced to by food supply. So if they're territorial, they're not going to abandon their territory. From what I've read, they won't necessarily stay on their territory all winter, but they won't go far from it. Their nesting territory, which is precious terrain, and they need to assert their dominance in that territory. So they don't go very far. Now, if suddenly the food supply petered out here, especially perhaps deer, might be a primary winter feed for ravens because so many get hit, then the ravens would start to move. It wouldn't be a migration, they would just go to where there's food, like the kind of Canada geese go a little ways for open water. Mary?
What's the size of their territory?
It depends on the amount of food. Depends on how much food there is. So it's totally variable. At the dump, there's no territory. And yeah, Heinrich documents multiple pairs nesting in close proximity because they didn't need to claim a territory. So their behavior in that way could expect with ravens is adaptable to the situation. Now, yeah, he might have mentioned there are studies I remember done in Germany. I can't remember the size. It totally depends on the food supply.
In where I live, there is a nesting pair that do have 3 nests, but it is so close together. Their territory is really little, and you go down, like 4 blocks, and but there's all those dumps. Nobody, the restaurants in town,
So you know of ravens nesting near you
Oh, yeah.
in Ponderosas?
There actually was in Ponderosa, the one nest is at 2 on my
Uh-huh. And then nearby other nests? Is that what you
Yeah,
said?
then
Other
there's other nests.
yeah,
I
other-
think that
another
Up on,
pair.
up on.
Yeah, so that fits that
that.
picture that we get,
In
yeah, with a large food supply, the territoriality breaks down. You have open dumpsters. Yeah, there's plenty of food. Mary?
Did anybody else has questions? I wrote down lots of questions. You talked about the feathers on the legs of the ravens, and so I'm wondering if do crows have that? Because that's a really distinctive feature between bald eagles and golden eagles. It's one of the things that I like hone in on, because golden eagles have these giant baffles on their legs, and the balds don't. But talk
Yeah.
about ravens.
I can answer that, but I'm going to wait until the crow person comes. And
Okay.
you can ask them. No, I don't know the answer yet.
Okay.
I wondered, because otherwise there can be a point of differentiation.
Yeah.
The crows don't have those bloomers when they're displaying, but I do not know. Kind of see those bloomers there.
Yeah.
The stick legs are completely hidden. So,
Okay. I have more questions, but I won't make a mistake.
yeah, it's 8 o'clock.
Well, he said that the males, you said males can't incubate the eggs. Did you mean that they don't?
Males what?
You said males can't incubate eggs.
Oh, yeah, they can't. They don't develop a brood patch.
Yeah, so I was wondering how that works. Like, so is it the female has like an area of their body that's specifically warmer? than the
Yes,
males
that
don't?
is the case. Yeah, that's true for probably, well, all incubating birds, I imagine. I'm not sure, but I would certainly all passerines, they actually lose feathers in a certain area on their chest, and it's highly vascularized, so it gets more heat from their body temperature, and it's passed from the skin in direct contact with the eggs. So that's a brood patch that develops in females. It doesn't develop in males. So apparently males will actually stand on the nest or crouch down and guard the eggs and look like they're incubating, but they aren't.
And you said that's pretty much true across the whole order of passerines.
I would assume.
Yeah.
I think it's almost a safe assumption that
Yeah.
it's true across the order, yeah.
Yeah.
So folks, thanks very much.